Hey folks, Steve here with another 1870 video. Today in this video, which I hope to be pretty short, but we'll see, is another sort of intro video. Maybe it could be seen as a setup and errata video. So let me get a couple of things out of the way, because I actually created this whole video once before, earlier this week, and I kept adding clips to it, a clip after a couple days or each day, and I would have a little bit more errata resolved or questions answered by Ray. And I realized that it was basically a 45-minute video of you guys kind of suffering through my questions and not knowing and having to stop and then getting answers and then having other questions that weren't answered yet. And I decided just to chuck that video in the garbage and say, okay, let's just start again. And I think I've got all the errata stuff figured out, and I've got my stuff set up. So let's go through. I even made a list of things that I talked about in my old video to make sure I could touch upon them in a clear way in this video. So first things first, I want to say that when it comes to CSL games and Ray Weiss and everything he's doing, I will say I appreciate what he's doing, right? I don't know any other way to say it. Ray is a good guy, and while some folks in the comments section of my previous video were kind of asking about me being, maybe seemingly harsh in my critiquing of the components or even the rules or whatever I'm talking about, I just want to kind of to specify for folks watching, my critiques are there to help the game, and they're not meant to be overly critical, and in many ways you're watching my game experience as I experience it, right? I'm not like playing this game off camera and then coming and telling you guys what I think. For this, much like I did the Dark Valley, we're going to play through the game and get a sense for it. I'm going to try to play through the whole scenario and get a feel for it and get thoughts, and but still so much of this is fresh for me, and I'm still figuring things out, and that's what's uncovering some of the errata stuff that I'm getting up to. So whatever I say here, I say with the best of intentions, because as I've mentioned before, I think in the last video, hopefully that part didn't get cut out, that the production and distribution model for CSL is print on demand. So when you purchase a game, a new copy is printed and then sent to you. So ideally, the things that I'm pointing out or that Ray is realizing, maybe didn't get addressed in the latest rules, errata, which happens in every war game, right? The game is not bad for having errata. It will be addressed, they can be addressed, and will feed into the next, version of the master files that are used to produce copies of the game. So that if you're watching this video, maybe by the time you purchase the game, all this stuff will have been factored in, and you're good to go. So the older this video is, the less relevant it is, because this errata stuff has gotten figured out. Because you got to remember, I'm playing what is probably one of the very first printed copies of the game. I think I had it pre-ordered before it even came out, and then it came out, and I got my copy pretty quickly. But it was the first run, I think, of not the first copy ever made, but within the first so many orders fulfilled, probably. And so it's still a very early copy that doesn't have errata that has since been published, right? But there's still things, even in the rules PDF, that is errata that I'm going to speak to here in this video. So again, I speak with as much admiration as I can for Ray. I think we're of similar age ranges, and I have a hard time conceptualizing trying to have my own game publishing company and making that work and figuring out a way to do it. And Ray is doing it, so props to him, and more power to him and the designs that he's putting out. And so, I'm giving this game attention because I want to support, the operation. I want to take a look at this game. Ultimately, every publisher has, sort of a responsibility to put out the best product that they can put out. And, I will still point out, if I see something really worth critiquing, I'm still going to do that, right? But just for viewers to understand, not doing it to really hurt on anybody, because I see it as a mechanism for improving the game experience for others to come. So, that previous video, is out the door. We're already 5 minutes into this video. Let's get into what we have been able to cover since that last video. All the errata that has been resolved up to this point. Let's go through it. So the X1, the 11th core listed in the setup, in terms of a counter, is the second core. So there was some confusion between Roman numerals and Arabic numerals at some point in the design process, and a couple of things got goofed there. So the 11th core is the second core. So the counter I pointed out in the last video that I used instead of the 11th core, which was the leftover second core, is just, go ahead and use that, right? If for some reason your copy of the game has a 2 core, number 2 on the counter, use that, and it's going to start with, I believe, 8 strength points. The unit that was not specified as being in the force pool, that extra cavalry division, indeed should go in the force pool, and I've got it set up on the force pool here. So far, my intuition on how I should proceed has been correct. I did manage to get the HQs with their starting strength points set up correctly. It took me taking all the core, setting them all out, setting up the strength points, and just, like a puzzle, just figuring out what I could make fit. I have 3 9 counters, a 3 and a 6 counter off to the side here that are sort of left over for the Germans. Seems like the Germans had a much harder time getting everything on the board than the French, but I managed to do it, so it's all on the board there. You can see the stacks are stacked up, and they're all set up there. So, no big deal. We'll have to see, I guess, as we get playing and we need to make change and we need to get the right denominations, are we going to run into issues? I guess we'll figure that out. I've got some alternative ways to deal with that, I think, if it really comes to it. For sure, my printed rules are much older than the latest rules that you would find in PDF form. Some of the things that are kind of taken out of that I discovered is that, and this is technically not listed as errata yet, but I don't know, Ray, if you're watching this video, you should just point this out for folks who may have older versions of the game. Or I guess just tell them to reference the latest PDF, right? That's what they should be doing. But for me, I actually had to watch out because the French setup is a little bit different in that there are stronger French stacks. So up here, there were some 8 stacks, well, they have now become 12 stacks, and there's even been an 8 stack that got reduced to a 6 stack in the setup. So that setup is different in the latest PDF than my printed copy. Again, for you, this probably will mean less if you're watching this video and you don't yet have a copy and you purchased a copy. Yours is probably going to be just fine. So for me, that was something I had to worry about. The book, neither the PDF nor my printed rules specified, well, I guess I should say, neither rules really specified how the game starts. Do you start with an administrative phase, which is the first part of a turn, or do you jump right into the action phase? My assumption was you jump right into the action phase, and Ray confirmed that to be the case. So we won't do an administrative phase. We'll simply jump into activating units. The next question was then, the printed rules say that the Germans can activate their first, second, and third armies, while the PDF says that the French get the first activation. They just get to activate one activation, which could be an army, could be a corps, could be whatever. And Ray confirmed that yes, it is the French who are going to get that first activation, so they will get to activate one thing. I think that came out of some play testing. They just found that worked better for getting the game going. So the French will start when we get going, and don't worry, the Germans have enough awesomeness to hit back, and I'll explain that here shortly. There was several questions around HQ elimination. So when we talked about, there in the rules, there's a straightforward thing where, if you roll certain dice, like doubles and stuff in combat, there's a chance that your leader could die, and you have to roll a die to find out. This is something that's in a lot of games from around this time period where an aggressive general, or just the generals in general could die in combat, and that is obviously a big loss if that general is very good. So there is that possibility that you lose a leader who is represented by the HQ. Now, in this case, ordinarily when you roll those dice and you get those certain results, the leader is going to end up down the turn track either on its regular side or, if you roll very poorly, on its replaced side, meaning a replacement leader had to be put into the job. And they're probably less effective. I'm pretty sure they're usually less effective. But you get that HQ back for free. But what questions I had for Ray, and he did answer them on Board Game Geek, were, well, what happens if an HQ is eliminated from stack elimination, either because a stack has to retreat and cannot, in which case the stack is eliminated, what happens to the HQ, or a stack is simply eliminated due to combat losses, it's got nothing left but the HQ and some strength points, and those are all destroyed, what happens? So he was able to confirm for me, and this is going to be errata that will be added to the PDF and future copies of the game, I suspect, is that those HQ, when they're eliminated, they do go back into the force pool like I assumed, and they go on their replacement side, which means, if you really indeed lose that corps leader or army leader or whatever, that HQ unit, via true elimination, right? You've been totally knocked out. You can buy HQ back during the administrative phase, right? You spend 5 replacement points, you can get HQs put on the board. Those units will come back if you decide to purchase them, but they will cost the 5 replacement points, and they will be on their reduced, or not reduced side, their replacement side. So my assumption there is that how that would work. Ray said, yes, that's how it would work. So my guess was correct, but again, this is important because the rules originally didn't say that. Need to make sure, I didn't want to proceed on an assumption. I wanted to make sure I was playing it right, so that's the right way to do it. Let's see, what else here? I had some questions before about the terrain check, or terrain chart. Terrain chart. You can see the combat procedure has you check strength points and then a ratio, and the ratio to terrain will determine the combat modifiers that you experience. Now there's a whole thing where, like, let's say 8 strength points are attacking 4 strength points. The 4 strength points are in a mountain. Well, if you check terrain, mountain terrain says to double the defender strength. So times 2, 4 becomes 8. So then it's 8 to 8. That's 1-to-1 odds. And then my question was, do you then count terrain again when you look at... oh boy, I'm going to have a hard time focusing. There we go. 1-to-1 odds. And then you look at mountain again. The terrain is mountain. 1-to-1 mountain is -3 for the attacker, +5 for the defender. I had to double check because I was wondering, like, well, wait a minute, is the doubling of the combat factors in mountain somehow already factored into this table? And I guess not. So you want to look at the terrain, and then the defender's strength points may be modified by good defensive terrain, and then that will further, whatever the ratio ends up after that will still be modified by the terrain. And I was trying to think up the numbers here, like if you had 28 combat factors attacking 4 combat factors, 24 doubles to 8, and 24 to 8 is 4-to-1 odds. 4-to-1 odds into mountain is still a -1 for the attacker. So you could as you're thinking about this, like 28 to 4 is normally 6-to-1 odds, but in mountain it's like, you're asking to lose. In that case, you're gonna probably lose that battle. You might not, do a whole lot of damage to your big monster stack, and you might be able to eventually wear down those 4 strength points, but you're not going to get anywhere, which makes, mountain terrain very powerful. But the thing is, there's not a lot of mountain terrain in the game. There's like, a handful, a couple of little places. So it really won't matter very much. Once we're out, once this is all resolved over here and we're pushing things back, the clear terrain will make that, less of a concern. But something I had to validate. I also had a question. I had a question about the right column of the terrain chart where it says FGRDRP. What does that mean? And what does the notation even mean on this terrain chart? Well, this column should be titled like Chasspot Fire Table, or modifiers or something like that. That column title doesn't make sense. That really ought to be changed. But what it's saying here is, and the rule book actually says this, but when you're doing your opportunity chasspot fire, if you're firing into clear terrain, you get one shift to the right, which is better for the French firing their guns. And if the person being shot at is in the mountains, you get one column shift to the left. So you see the little caret greater than less than sign pointing. I'm going to have a field day with this focus. The little pointing to the right or pointing to the left, that's one column shift to the right, one column shift to the left. So kind of weird, because when I see greater than or less than signs, I'm thinking like we're making an evaluation check or something. But no, that's just meant to be like an arrow shifting one to the right, one to the left, and the chasspot fire table's up here, which is just, depending on the number of depending on what you roll versus the number of combat factors getting to fire, you can cause a certain number of losses that need to be absorbed. Let's see. I swear we're going to make this video not too terribly long, guys. One thing I'll say, just as a side note, that I think the map looks really great in Vassal. But the map, I think it looks great in Vassal. I've seen pictures. I haven't opened the Vassal module itself, but the map looks pretty good. When it got printed on whatever the material is, the paper for the print map, the colors don't necessarily mesh super great, and it's the tone of the color and the color choices that, again, are just kind of a challenge. You can see the hex numbers relatively clearly there, right? 0913, 0914. I found that once you started having, let's see if I can find a good example. When you're looking at where the hex is got water on it, or railroad, or forest, or mountain, it gets really hard to read that brown color they use for the hexes and the hex numbers. It can get really hard to read, and of course you can kind of count other hexes and then count down to where you're trying to find where you're looking for setup, but I just found it a little difficult. Now once the game gets going, it probably won't really matter because we're going to be moving stuff around, but just for setup it was like, oh, I got to find this hex, and I'm kind of judging roughly where the hex is. And there's just something with the way the colors came out, or the layers of the image file, that the hexes were a lower level layer than the rivers and the railroads or something. I don't know. It's just a little hard to read sometimes, so I don't know. That's a nitpick. Probably not one worth worrying about too much, but I just thought I would bring it up because it was kind of a pain in some ways to set some of the units up, trying to find the right hex if it didn't have a city in it or a town. But again, not the end of the world there. Okay, and the final thing, in terms of like the errata and stuff we were worrying about before, I kind of realized that the counter density isn't so bad, right? It's not so bad. These are thicker counters, so picking these guys up and moving them around, there's a little bit of congestion here, especially at the beginning of the game when all the forces are sort of lined up and we're ready to start fighting. I realized something, and it's like, it should be obvious, and it clicked right after I was recording the last video earlier this week, was that, okay, we got the force pool, we got the counters that we could build out of the force pool, we got the extra strength points. If I wanted to, and I'm debating on whether or not I actually want to do it, maybe I will, maybe I won't, we'll have to figure that out. These boxes can be used as holding boxes, right? I mean, they're force pool boxes, right? You set the counter there, and when you're ready to buy it, cool. If it's not on the map, it's on the force pool or permanently eliminated. So, why not, right? If it's like, hey, here's the Baden core. Well, the Baden core counter is on the map. I could put the strength points that I've sort of assigned to the Baden core here, and I suspect this was intentional because the boxes here are big enough that you could set these counters, in here and have it not be covering this guy. So it's like, oh, this core has this many strength points. And all of a sudden that makes this game get even more clean, because then it's almost like a 1 to 2 or 3 counter per hex game instead of a, what it could possibly be quite a bit more. And if I have to make 8 strength points out of like, 4 2 denomination counters, that's not that big of a deal. I don't have to be playing around knocking stuff over here. I can just do it over there out of the way, and the only thing I have to worry about is making sure that I'm keeping good track of who's losing what and where and which HQ or in which place. But again, I think, with the counters now being fewer on the map, that wouldn't be too hard to manage. So before I actually start playing in the next video, sorry guys, I think I'm going to. I don't know. The more I talk about it, the more I like the idea of moving all this over. Now, for the stacks that are only strength points, I would leave them alone, right? They don't have an HQ on the force pool, related to the force pool that they're using. They're using the inherent division command that we would have to use. And that's what you use when you don't have an actual core leader. You can move just a handful of strength points. I can leave them on the map because that's going to be 1 to 2 counters. Not a big deal. They can move independently. And then everything else will be, if you're stacked with a core, you're either going to be, moving with the core and put on the force pool in the holding box, or you're planning on splitting them up again. So not a big deal. I think that's a good idea. And again, I assume this is intentional. If it's just a happy accident, then congratulations. That's a nice happy accident. But I like the idea. The more I think about it, I think that's going to be much easier to figure out. Maybe if you're looking at combat odds and you're trying to say like, okay, well, there's 8 here, there's 9 here, and you can just read that there's 8 there by looking at the counters, and instead I have to look over here and count 8 for that core and 8 for that core. I don't know. There's probably pros and cons to it, but the more I think about it, it might just make it easier for the camera to deal with. Something like that. I don't know. Okay, so let's talk about some good stuff in the time remaining in the video. I'm going to put a cut here just because this is kind of a longer cut, and I'm going to make sure I have an opportunity to speak coherently before the camera freaks out. So I'm going to put a cut, and we'll talk about some good stuff. Okay, so talking about the good stuff, because I feel like all this criticism, all this errata stuff is probably giving you bad vibes. Let's talk about some good vibes. Let's get the good vibes going here, guys. So something, now that I've read through the rules quite a bit, I'm pretty familiar with them. I've read them over. I've gotten the answers from Ray on how things are supposed to work. All the little gaps that I was seeing or thought I was seeing in the rules have been cleared up. I think I've got everything I need to get going. Here are some cool things that I appreciate about the game already, and we'll see how it all plays out. Even though these forces on the map, 2 major European powers in the long century, and you might think from like a really high, it's an army and they have similar tactics and they're going to be the same. Well, obviously the real answer is no, of course not. They had different doctrines, they had different styles, they organized differently. And thankfully the game represents this with a good degree of asymmetry in the sides' ability to act on the map. Some of this is explicitly stated via rules that differ between the two, and then there are other ways that are more, they're there as a function of other game mechanics, and you will see that. So let's talk about first the chassepot rifle difference. So in the Franco-Prussian War or the Franco-German War, however you want to look at it, one of the advantages the French had was that they used the chassepot rifle. I'm probably not saying that right, but I can't speak French, so deal with it. And the Germans used the Dreise needle gun. Maybe I'm not saying that right either. Bear with me. So the Dreise needle gun was, a fine weapon. Did what it needed to do. Same thing with the chassepot rifle, but the chassepot rifle had longer range. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, I'd love to be corrected, but I believe it had much longer range, which allowed the French. When you think about the way armies can interact with one another on the battlefield, that the French could fire upon the Germans before the Germans could get in range to fire back, essentially, right? And you say if your opponent has longer range than you, they can fire at you while you're still moving. In fact, you may be moving under fire until you can bring the enemy under the range of your own equipment. And some of this is just represented by the Zoc movement. So yeah, moving into and out of Zocs, that's always kind of a thing. Maybe you're spending extra movement points to get in and out. But when the Germans come into a French zone of control, they are going to take chassepot fire, opportunity chassepot fire. And what that is going to entail is all the units, all the strength points that are there that could fire on that unit, that are projecting the Zocs into the hex that the unit's moving into, will add up to a roll. You'll roll the dice, and then depending on what you've rolled, you're going to take some losses on the German force. And maybe it'll only be peppering them. They're only losing a little tiny bit, but over time that could just be very valuable because you're just inflicting those paper cuts before even the big battles are going. And I think that's kind of interesting. The other thing that's worth talking about, and in fact, I'm going to debut my player aid sheet to talk about it. So I did create a player aid sheet. I uploaded it to Board Game Geek. This is a newer version than what's on Board Game Geek. I got to add this because I added this extra box of text to the PDF. But I collected a lot of the special rules that I would find relevant to reference as you play through the game rather than flipping through the rule book. There are some things on here. So let's talk about the command limits first, right? So the French division can have, all division HQ can control 4 strength points, or move with them, command them, set them in action. A core HQ of the French can do 12, right? So all those stacks of French that have 12, they can operate, and then the army can do 16. By comparison, the Germans have a smaller command limit. Their inherent division, those stacks without a leader HQ counter, can only be 3 strength points for activation. Regular divisions can do 4, their core can do 8, and their armies can do 12. So if you think about that, it's on the board, the French can be moving in one activation much larger bodies of men, which I could see as an advantage, right? You're going to bring 12 guys to a fight, whereas on the attack, the Germans may only be bringing, 8 by comparison, or something like that, right? If it's a core-to-core equivalence there. But, you say, hey, that's all really great for the French. What else do the French get? Well, the French, and this is one of those things as a function of the design, less than a special rule, they're going to be dealing with interior lines of communication, right? You're coming into France. They've got French territory. They control the preponderance of fortresses on the game map. So it'll be their fortresses to help them in defense and combat and all that good stuff. They're better situated behind the rivers. So the rivers are going to support the French in their endeavor. But they have to be dealing with the tremendous advantage that the Germans have. And the Germans do have quite a bit. So if we look at the replacement point stuff, so in terms of replacement points, the French by rule get 10 replacement points per turn. The Germans get 14, so 40% more, which is pretty good. In terms of mobilization costs, though, for every French strength point built in an administrative phase, they have to spend 2 replacement points. So if they decided to spend all their replacement points on reinforcements, they're only going to get 5 strength points a turn. But you don't want to do that. You want to use those points for other things. You want to save them up for other things. That's really tough. The Germans, by comparison, only have to spend 1 replacement point per strength point, which means if they wanted to, they could build 14. So think about it that way. 14 strength points put on the map, as opposed to only 5 by default. Again, the Germans are going to be using those replacement points for other things as well, but there you go. And then they each pay 5 to put an HQ on the map, so that's similar. But you can imagine that is a pretty strong advantage, and ultimately, yeah, it really is. The other thing that the Germans get, which I find to be very powerful, and this represents their better, I don't know if it was artillery doctrine, but they definitely had really good artillery, so it's some combination of artillery doctrine and equipment, that when it comes time to do artillery, this is a special modifier for combat. Basically, you spend, for the French, they're spending as many resource points as strength points in the combat in order to get a possible reroll on their combat dice for one of the dice, right? You can turn a 1 into anything better than a 1, right? That's better. And you make that decision. Are you going to do it or not? And you're going to spend the resource points. So if you imagine, like, hey, 12 versus 12, right? Let's do an equivalent battle. 12 strength points of French versus 12 of German. The French would have to spend 12 replacement points to do artillery, which is a lot. But the Germans only have to spend half of their SP. So the French would spend 12, the Germans would only spend 6. And again, because the Germans are going to have more resource points anyway, they're kind of more able to bring artillery into combats anyway. Even those smaller combats, it's cheaper. It's half the price. They have just more capability to use artillery and use it more consistently. So there's a lot of ways to look at that. Maybe that's ultimately, at the end of the day, all a function of German states, Prussia and its allies being a little more industrialized, a little more capable of putting bodies of men equipped with decent equipment into the war than the French, which just didn't quite have the same level of sophistication there. The other thing I guess I should point out is that inherent division difference. So when those forces up to 3, and I forgot to remove the hyphen out of my copy and paste, so 3 for the Germans, or 4 for the French, those forces without an HQ can activate and have an inherent division HQ. And these inherent division HQs are not invisible things that are just there. They actually have values. So HQs have an AB, an attack bonus, a DB, a defense bonus, and a movement allowance, which is how they move stuff. The French inherent division doesn't have a bonus to attack, but does have a bonus to defense. Again, that could be seen as an expression of chassepot fire and interior lines, but they can't move as far. They only have 3 movement points, whereas the Germans have no bonuses either way, but have 4 movement points. And if you just look at the HQs on the map anyway, just as an example down here, we'll look. The French HQ core has 3 movement points, the Germans have 4. There is one that has 3, but you'll find that many of them do end up having 4. If we look up here, some even have 5, and then obviously the cavalry can move pretty swiftly. But you put it on the whole, there is some, and there are some high movement French ones as well, don't get me wrong. But there's certainly an element here of different org structures for the army, different methods of activating those units. Something to watch out for is that there's really functionally only one French army HQ on the board, and that's Napoleon. The Germans have 3, and because you can activate an HQ that will activate another HQ from an army to a corps, you can have much wider sweeping maneuvers as the Germans. So again, just representing different ways that these armies were organized and structured. The Germans tended to provide more sort of like leeway or initiative or freedom of command than the French did. So their officers on the German side were more enabled to take action and to handle things. And so just that maturity of the command structure is going to give, maturity of that plus all the resource kind of efficiencies that the Germans have, give them a tremendous amount of power aligned against the French that still have plenty of men, interior lines, defensive terrain to rely upon, and the game will sort of play out, how that's all going to shake out. And who knows who will win when I play this, right? I'm going to be playing it solo. I'm going to be playing it little bits at a time and trying to figure things out. The Germans, as the historical victors, maybe I'll be biased, maybe? I don't know. I'm going to screw up my words here. I'm going to be biased to have the Germans win, but honestly, I'll just be playing each side to the best of my ability as I can to see what happens here. So yeah, there are the good vibes, guys. There's a lot of goodness here based on my readings of the rules and reflecting of history, which will make this a fun thing to try out, and we'll see how the game actually flows here very soon. Ultimately, to say my true thoughts on the game, I want to save all of that for the review that will come in time as we finish out the scenario and I have a better feel for the game at the end of the day. So we'll see what happens. In terms of what to expect, the next video we'll get playing with the French activation. Now, the total game runs from turn 1 to turn 17 across the month of August and just the very beginning of September of 1870. I'm hoping that because the Germans can activate armies that can activate corps and everything, that truly the number of activations that I need to make won't actually be that that many all the time. Like I won't have to stop and move every single counter. I can kind of take an activity, record it, talk about it, and move the next set of guys. Maybe I can get like 3 turns in a single video because the Dark Valley was so big, and that was the thing we were just playing previously. I can maybe get this knocked out. We'll see in like 6 videos. We'll see. I don't know. Maybe the first few videos will be slower as we play through the game and I really describe what I'm thinking and what's happening. And then once we get past the first few turns, we'll move more swiftly. So we'll see. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, how you would like to see me play this. What do you think would work best? A really detailed form of recording it, or a little more high level so we move a little more swiftly. I'll maybe leave that up to you guys and what you're thinking. So that'll do it for this video. Again, this is just looking at the setup, making sure I got the setup correctly. I do. All the resource points are set up. The VP is at 11. All the units are set up. I didn't set them up in maybe the best possible way. A lot of the setup is pointing to setting up either in a hex or adjacent to it. You can stack a whole bunch of units together, but I chose to kind of separate them out a little bit, just to ease in seeing where is what. But I might decide after I put units off into the holding boxes to stack core together so that I can just move them around easier. I don't know. We'll take a look at that as we get started in the next video. But there's what we're kind of looking at for the beginning of this war. Interestingly, there's a nice open path here into some German forts. But those French might get simply cut off if they decide to move forward that way. So anyway, yeah, that's it, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Take care. Keep on gaming. Have fun. Hit like if you like this video. Subscribe if you want to see more.